Hare Krishna Maharaj, humble obeisances. Thank you very much for joining again for the Monks podcast.
The pleasure, Chaitanya Charan Prabhu.
It's more than what we share with others. I feel myself very enlivened and illumined by your association. Sometimes I feel this Monks podcast is my excuse for getting association of devotees. So I'm grateful that you're spending the time, Maharaj.
I think you've been doing it with many devotees, right?
Yes, man. See, recently, maybe because of lockdown, many Vaishnavas have agreed to come forward. So I had done with Garuda Prabhu recently, then Anuttama Prabhu, and then Bhakti Marg Maharaj, Hridayanand Maharaj, then also with Jaidat Maharaj I did long ago. Then some younger devotees from the second generation. Yesterday I did with two, in fact I had two yesterday. There was Sri Nandanandan Prabhu, Stephen Knapp, and I also did with from India with Bhakti Vinod Maharaj. We discussed a little bit about the history of Indian outreach and analyzing what worked, what did not work. So he's also quite interested in Western outreach. That's how we bonded. So it is coming up quite well. But I think among all podcasts, our podcasts have been consistently regular and they are quite widely viewed also. So I'm grateful to you, Maharaj, for sparing the time.
I think these intellectual discussions are necessary, where we probe, analyze, discuss various topics of interest to all of us in the modern day and age.
Yes, Maharaj.
To apply bhakti in the modern age, how to adapt changing circumstances whilst performing our devotional services faithfully.
Yes, Maharaj.
There are so many aspects that need to be discussed, which need churning.
Yeah.
So I think it's good that this churning process is going on.
Yes, Maharaj. Thank you. I thought that could be the basis for our discussion today itself. With respect to modernity and bhakti. So is bhakti anti-modern or pro-modern? And so I did a little bit. Is that okay? We could discuss on that subject, Maharaj.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, I looked at the definitions of modernity, and some of them may not apply immediately to us, because technically many people say that the modern age ended with the 1930s or the Second World War or in the 1960s, and now what they have is postmodernism. But in other cases, it's differentiated between pre-modern and modern, and postmodernism is still considered like within the broader subset of modern. And in India, I think we can say postmodernism is coming, but it's like in the rural areas, modernity is also not reached. And in some urban areas, postmodernism is also reached. So it's a flux. But broadly, when I look at modernity, what are the aspects that could possibly intersect with bhakti? So I made a list of a few, and maybe we could discuss on them. So broadly, there is modernity is associated with change in economics, change in society, change in politics, and change in individuality. So that means change in economics means the economy moved either from feudalism or agrarianism to more of capitalism. Of course, there's communism also, but capitalism has become more, or it's called as a free market economy. That is the economic. Then from a social perspective, it was a shift more from say rural living to urban living. Not everyone, but at least it is aspired. Then in politics, it was a movement more from monarchy of various kinds toward democracy. Again, it has not necessarily happened, but that's what is aspired for. And within individuality, it has moved from more like hierarchy toward equality. So that everybody is equal and everybody is entitled to freedom and equality before the law, that kind of things. And the last factor, which probably would be the most important for us, is that in the religious and cultural aspects, there has been a consistent questioning, if not rejecting, of tradition. And if there is not again a rejecting of religion, but there is at least a relegation of religion to the private domain from the public sphere. So the public sphere will be non-religious. We have discussed secularism earlier. So there is within all of these, there are subtleties, because although religion has gone down, the idea of spirituality has come up. And spirituality is associated more with individuality rather than a collective whole. But these are the 5 broad aspects. So did you have, are these something which you would like to discuss, or you would like to take in some other direction?
No, I'm fine with this. But just some opening remarks based on what you said.
Yeah.
I think the distinctions between modernism, postmodernism, etc., I would think it's more technical for the purposes of our discussion. Although there are some differences, which is why postmodernism has evolved as a separate category in the eyes of many. But as far as we are concerned, anything that is contemporary, current, that relates to our times, the present times, or to recent times, is what we would consider modern, right?
Yes.
I mean, from a broader point of view, let's say 20 years down the line, the think postmodernism may evolve into some other form, morph into some other form. But for us, 20 years then, that will be modern.
Okay.
So I'm referring to modern more in the sense of contemporary.
Okay.
Whatever the prevailing contemporary philosophy, that is what I would refer to as modern. Not getting into the technicalities of
I agree.
Modernism and such things, because our concern as devotees is to see how we can deal with and adjust to ever-changing situations in the environment. The world outside and its values are changing very rapidly. And the pace of change is also is increasing.
Yes, that is true.
So somehow, in this rapidly changing environment, we as devotees have to adjust. On one hand, we have a philosophy, we have a way of life, we have a culture, but we have a situation which is rather incompatible in the sense that we are living in the midst of a society whose norms and mores and values are changing very fast.
Yes.
So I would say that as the society is moving from traditional to the modern, certain values have emerged which are primary. So you've mentioned most of them. One is the primacy of the individual.
Yes.
Whereas the tradition focused more on the collective. In the modern day, the focus more is on the individual, and therefore the clamoring for rights, individual rights, as opposed to
responsibilities. Or
it's not that in the tradition individualism wasn't valued. But the focus today is excessively on individuals. So the primacy of the individual. Then there is also the emphasis on unbridled freedom of speech and expression. And people don't like any limitations or any restrictions to be placed on that. One could also talk egalitarianism, which you mentioned, the equality, which is bridging the gap between um, people and making them more or less peers.
Yes.
So the idea of subordinate and superior is getting, the difference is getting erased and
Yeah.
diminished.
Yes, Maharaj, that is true.
So in this egalitarian kind of an approach,
Yeah.
and also then of course the critical inquiry. You were mentioning about how they want to examine religion or anything, any entrenched belief from the past. They want to
Yes.
see critical eye.
Yeah.
So I would say these are the issues that we need to really grapple with. So I think I'm fine to go along in this direction.
Yes, Maharaj. This is a good framework. Rather than looking at areas, we could look at values. Because in a sense, for us as individual devotees, we can't really do much about, say, the political change from feudalism to democracy, or from maybe from, we can do some things, but not much about the change from agrarianism to capitalism or industrialism. But the individual values, we can deal with them one by one. And so I think we could take that approach, Maharaj. We can look at some typical modern values and see how we move forward. Just one point about the difference between modernity and post-modernity, which we could address, or which could keep in mind, that modernity was fueled by the strong hope of technological and political progress. The idea that in the past people were primitive and we are going to become better people, not just better technologically, but humanity itself is evolving towards becoming better. That hope was very strong. And postmodernity has replaced that with cynicism, not even skepticism, but cynicism. That, that actually whatever we called as progress, that was just a construct of some people, and society has not actually progressed, or society is not progressing. And that rejection of tradition is even more vehement in postmodernism. But this idea of that technology will lead to unadulterated human good, that was punctured by especially by the Second World War, which led to a lot of technologically fueled, or technologically brought about destruction of human life and property. So maybe we could start with your framework.
Yeah.
That
It's interesting that in the modern era, by the modern era, I refer to the post-industrial revolution era. The modernism, as we define it, is more or less a 20th century phenomenon.
Okay.
Because technology primarily strengthened in the 20th century, started in the 19th, but 20th century it became very strong and focused. So and with that, certain approaches to life, certain values, certain philosophies emerged, which involved critically questioning tradition and to a large degree, even rejecting it. Now, the moment critical inquiry progresses by its natural momentum, and values, they move on, what happens is that they tend to eat into themselves.
Okay.
They eat themselves in the sense that they evolve in such a way that whatever were the values that they espoused at a certain generation, that same trend of thinking then rejects the earlier trend of thinking.
Yes.
And a series of philosophies emerging, each of which critiques and rejects the philosophy that came prior to it. And I think the best example of that would be what we are seeing now. I think in our previous podcast, or maybe the one before that, you briefly mentioned in the opening remarks about cancel culture.
Yes.
Right? And in the cancel culture, they're basically coming down heavily on people who make statements or who act in a way that certain people find very, very objectionable.
Yes.
And then they go to very great extents to actually denigrate them in such a way that they lose their reputation. And they also take action to ensure that they lose their livelihood. If they're
Yes.
professors in an academic institution, they make sure that they don't get their contract renewed. Or if they're writing a book or have a speaking assignment, they make sure it gets canceled because they badmouth that person so much. And interestingly, the victims of this, at least many of them, are themselves those who are liberal minded.
Yes. So it's the word they use is woke. This is called the woke. Those who have awakened themselves to, say, contemporary values or postmodern values, and saying among at least conservatives that you can never be woke enough. You may be woke today, but by tomorrow's standards, you will be considered still primitive. So there is an astonishing amount of or presumption of moral superiority, that no other people are as moral as we are. And even venerable people from the past, their good deeds are overlooked, and their moral flaws are highlighted. That's why in America there's been breaking down of many statues of, even say there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, and he's freeing a slave. So and that statue was built by blacks, but they're saying that he freed the slaves is not the good thing. That he thought that I am doing something benevolent by freeing the slaves. So that was the idea, that he's freeing them. That was a gesture over there. This is who is he to think that he can free? And they saw that as a symbol of the slavery in America, and they wanted to, they destroyed that basically. So that presumption of moral superiority is astonishing, actually.
Yeah. So we see that those very same thought processes, that very same mindset that began in the late 19th century and strengthened in the 20th century, that focused on rejecting tradition, lock, stock, and barrel, at each generation, that is leading to a philosophy that rejects the previous one. And this is going to be a continuous process. So those who call themselves postmodernists now, in the next generation, they will be rejected by the others who come up with a newer philosophy.
Yes.
So, we are as we are in a situation where there's a constant storm of evolving philosophies, and there's going to be no end to it, because that is the nature of intellectualization.
Yes, Maharaj.
Too much of blind material intellectualization, too much of rejection of standard spiritual beliefs and principles can only result in more bewilderment and continuous rejection.
Yes, Maharaj, that's true.
And each generation is going to feel like the way you've mentioned now, that they're going to have a sense of moral superiority over the others, and the others were wrong, and we are more liberal than you, we are more this than you, and that's how it's going to move. So for us as devotees, the concern is that we don't get blown away or swept away by these ever-changing tides of contemporary philosophies,
Yes, Maharaj, that's true.
So at any point in time, we are going to be under pressure to conform to contemporary ideas and beliefs and practices.
Yeah. So
the pressure will be because on one side we have some traditional principles and values, and the other side, the need to have some affinity or be relevant to the modern situation at whatever time period is going to cause tension.
Yes, Maharaj, that's true. So just to reiterate this point of unrestricted rationality or unrestricted questioning of authority. I read an interesting essay by Tamal Krishna Maharaj. He described the history of Western civilization in these terms. He said that in European history, there are primarily three main movements, roughly the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. There was a Renaissance, then there was the Reformation, then the Church, and there is the scientific revolution. And then basically they say that the seeds of modernity were sown in the Renaissance, and they started fructifying from the scientific revolution onward. So he said that the Renaissance, so prior to that, this world was seen primarily as a place of test and transit. We are living in this world. Jesus said this world is like a bridge, and we are meant to go to another world. And in fact, many thinkers have said that one of the defining differences between pre-modern and modern thought is the importance given to another world as life's ultimate destination. In modernity, that idea has been more or less rejected. This world is where we will progress and where we'll create heaven. So Renaissance said that this world itself is a manifestation of God's beauty and glory. And so the idea of how this world is to be seen, there's a significant amount of world acceptance and rejection of the biblical view of the world as a place of test and trouble. Then, so the verdict about the world was questioned. Then Reformation was where the authority of the priests to interpret or their monopoly on explaining the word, that was questioned. And some Protestants who said that we will, every reader has the right to read the Bible for themselves and interpret it. In the past, because printing press is also not there, so people couldn't read much. It was mostly they would go and hear. So they said every reader can interpret the Bible. So that first was rejection of God's view of the world. Now this is oversimplified, but then there was a question of, there was a rejection of God's representatives to explain the world, explain God's word. So then now Protestantism exhibited what you said. So there are currently between 55,000 to 75,000 Protestant denominations. And they keep, because there's no authority, they keep morphing into more and more. And then the scientific revolution, when it came, it questioned God's existence itself. So God's view of the world is questioned first, the power of God's representatives is concerned, and then the existence of God itself is questioned. Now, not everybody in the scientific revolution were atheists, but the point was that rather than depending on God for humanity's upliftment, it was seen that we humans can lift ourselves up through our rationality in thinking and through our technology in living. So that rejection, it seems to be a rejection of authority, seems to be a defining characteristic. Now, this is not always bad, because sometimes there were superstitions, there were oppressive power structures. But just as blind faith is problematic, so blind skepticism is also problematic. Yes, Maharaj.
Yes. Ati sarvatra varjayet.
Okay, yes, that's true. Ati sarvatra varjayet.
Of anything should be given up. Ati means, an excess. Sarvatra means always and everywhere. Varjayet means one should give up. So I think what has happened is that certain noble values, like freedom of speech, like critical inquiry, like individualism, the respect for the individual and dignity of the individual. These are all very noble values, which any enlightened civilization or society should have. And as far as from the Bhakti point of view, this is definitely given. It is there, Our Vedic scriptures are also indicative of that. Critical inquiry, Athatu Brahma Jigyasa, that is, now you inquire into the absolute truth. So definitely these are values that are also enshrined in the Vedic literatures and in the Vedic culture. But when these things are carried to an extreme without an anchor, without a reference, merely
Hmm.
on the whims of mundane intellect
Hmm.
and on mundane wrangling,
Hmm.
then you end up in an endless, downward spiral,
Yeah.
and you go into an interminable uh, phase of rejection after rejection, rejection after rejection of anything that came before you.
Yeah.
So it's because there is no anchor there. So it's a difference of degree.
Yes.
All these values are cherished in the Vedic culture, but now as the society becomes uh, more and more quote unquote modern, as time is passing, the degree of these things that they want is
Hmm.
increasing day by day, and that is what is causing the problem. So going to the other extreme, for example, the important point you made about rejection of authority, Srila Prabhupada said he encouraged being independently thoughtful also.
Hmm.
You see the harmonious, uh, shall we say, coexistence of surrender to a spiritual master on one hand and to Krishna,
Hmm.
and on the other hand, being independently thoughtful, they're reconciled very harmoniously in the bhakti path. Yes, so there is scope for expression of individuality, there is scope for free speech, there is scope for inquiry, all of that. But
Hmm.
it's reconciled. There is a healthy reconciliation that is possible within the
Yes.
fold of bhakti. But when you come out here, the authority, you reject the authority completely, and then you're left with no anchor.
Yes.
So there is a problem when authority is abused. That is a major problem, undoubtedly, and that has been one cause, an important cause for the rejection of authority.
Yes, Maharaj.
But to throw the baby out with the bathwater
Yeah.
not going to help.
Yes, Maharaj. This is like avoiding excesses. And this last point about the values, they're there in our tradition also. See, one of the problems with the modern approach is that within the modern worldview, which often tends to be materialistic, non-theistic, within the modern worldview itself, there is no basis for the values that it considers sacred. Say, for example, equality. Uh, we may say that we believe people are equal, but if we are just machines, biological robots, then what is the basis of equality? If you look at IQ, you look at EQ, look at any parameters, people are different. So, in fact, the way materialism moves forward, we all believe that we have freedom. In fact, freedom is a very cherished value. But as materialism moves forward, more and more the idea is becoming fashionable among mainstream scientists that we have no free will, that actually we are just products of our of biological programming. So, in a sense, there is this disconnect, almost like a cognitive dissonance, that certain values we consider sacred, so freedom or equality, but they have no basis in the very foundational worldview. So, Einstein said that there is science and there is scientism. So Einstein said that if I were something, I'm paraphrasing that, if I accepted science completely, if I accepted scientism, then I would have to believe that the Nazis were not responsible for the Holocaust because they were just programmed that way to hate and to kill. And One more, this self-sabotaging problem is that we all need a moral compass and at least some understanding of what is right and wrong. That may vary. And where does that come in modernity from? So in the past, it came primarily from religious scriptures. In the modern times, people think that they will get it. Morality can come from rationality. But it's not that simple. Now, we may rationally know that some things are right, but still we may not be able to do them. Or for that matter, rationality may lead us to certain things which we can rationally justify them, but they are morally unconscionable. In fact, say the whole idea of the Holocaust was, at that time, Germany was among the most progressive in science, and eugenics, which said that some races are superior to others and we want to evolve the most superior race. That was based on the prevailing science of its time. Not that all scientists subscribe to it, but rationally, that was, you could make a case for it. Similarly, much of what is called as a Planned Parenthood, with respect to what is called a euphemism for abortion, that movement, the woman who's, I think, Elizabeth Singer, who started that, in a private letter, she said that actually this is the way we can remove the blacks from our society. And she was very explicitly racist. And that's a very problematic statement for people, because they say blacks won't be able to maintain themselves. And another very graphic example of this was in the Journal of Bioethics. There is one atheistic philosopher who took this reasoning forward, and he said that if a mother wants, she can abort the child after he is born also. And it led to such a vehement opposition to him, and in the comments online and everywhere. And he said, all these arguments are sentimental. He said, and if all these arguments can be applied even to the child in the womb. From the biological perspective, the location of the embryo doesn't determine its status. So then, morality, so rationality alone cannot give rise to morality. So in that sense, although modernity thinks of itself as progressive, but some of the founding values, they cannot come from a modern worldview. Any thoughts on this, Maharaj?
Yes, it is this thought process, this kind of thinking that leads to the logical conundrums that you have just referred to. Mm-hmm. The fundamental point is that if your foundation is ever changing, then everything that you construct on top of that will also be fleeting and liable to collapse. Because rationality is based on human understanding and intelligence, just on its own strength. Mm-hmm. So the conceptions of what is rational and what is irrational will also change with time. They are different according to the different conceptions and perceptions of different people. Mm-hmm. So what is rational to you is not rational to me now. What was rational to one generation may not be rational to another generation. So understandings of rationality will change with time. And because they're based on the flickering and the ever-changing material intellect and conception of life. So therefore, whatever construct that you have based on that rationality will also be ever-changing. It cannot be steadfast. Yeah. It cannot be stable and steady. So if you build a whole system of morality purely on rationality, it cannot sustain.
Yes.
It cannot endure. So therefore, as I mentioned earlier, you have a rudderless, anchorless kind of a boat that's being tossed around in the waves of an ocean. The ocean of material existence has innumerable waves.
Hmm.
And all these waves are of different types and of different magnitudes. And they all represent, in this, if you can make an analogy in this context, that the different thought processes, different ideas, sometimes there is a wave that comes from this direction, sometimes the stronger waves come from another direction because of the wind blowing this way and that way.
Hmm.
And a boat that is not strong enough, that simply gets tossed around here and there, a sailboat. So similarly, if the individual is not moored or anchored in something that is permanent, that is enduring, something that is changeless, then everything that the individual constructs at a physical level, mental level, behavioral level, cultural level, at all levels will be constantly changing.
Hmm.
And it will lead to constant bewilderment, constant rejection, where rejection becomes the norm.
Yes, Maharaj. That's true.
So the need for basing our thought processes, our rationality even, our logic, our values, our morals, on scripture, which is the steady bedrock of everything, is all the more required.
Yes, Maharaj. Of course, just to speak from a different perspective, to some extent, the rejection itself has its values. In a sense, when we started trying to spread, our movement started spreading in the West, it was if people had not rejected the Judeo-Christian values, which were prominent at their times, then there would not have been this interest in Eastern spirituality. So, and in general, when people explore something new, in India spirituality is not new, but in the rest of the world it was new. So it is to some extent because people were exploring based on rationality, and from a rationality cannot give ultimate answers conclusively or exhaustively. But if from a rational perspective, it could be that some traditions can have a more rational explanation of life than other traditions. And in that sense, if there was complete adherence to tradition, then the possibility of outreach and the spreading of bhakti would also have not been possible. So rationality needs to be given its due, but as you said, avoid the excesses.
Sometimes, in the context in which you mentioned, it is the question of giving up one tradition for another.
Okay, so it's not rejection of tradition per se, but rejection of a particular tradition.
Because it answered more of our questions and gave more comprehensive answers to the important questions of life.
Yes, Maharaj.
Today, however, see, even those devotees who came from other religious backgrounds, even if they were religious, when they accepted Vedic culture or Krishna consciousness, they accepted the tradition that was formerly, unknown to them, that was alien to them when they came in touch with it. They did not wholesale reject everything that their previous religious tradition stood for. For example, they did not give up the idea that there is a God. They did not give up the idea that we must realize that God. They did not give up the idea that God has created this world. But it's just that they got a more elaborate, convincing, and comprehensive explanation from the Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, etc.
Yes.
Whereas, what is happening today at the non-spiritual or non-religious level is a wholesale rejection of tradition, the good and the bad.
Yes.
There are certain aspects of tradition which could be adjusted, because merely because something is tradition, it doesn't mean we should blindly accept it either. So one time, I think some years ago, we were talking about this, about having enlightened tradition.
Yes.
Yes, enlightened values. So the wholesale rejection, the blind wholesale rejection of tradition is what I'm questioning. There are certain aspects of tradition we may, number one, reject completely if they're not in line with Guru Sadhu Shastra from our point of view. Number two, we may adjust or compromise with certain elements of tradition for the sake of the highest goal of bhakti, either for our own practice or for the propagation of bhakti. So, but if the rejection of tradition is based solely on quote unquote rationality, then that leads to a problem. Then that leads to atheism.
Yes, that's true.
And no matter what kind of morality or values you attempt to create on the platform of atheism, is going to drive us to all these logical conundrums.
Yes, that's true. Just echoing what you said, Maharaj, Prabhupada would sometimes say that in the West, that I have come to tell you what you have forgotten. So it's not so much give something new, but that what you have forgotten, Prabhupada would sometimes say it's God. So we may be giving, or we were giving maybe newer or broader understandings of God, maybe some newer ways of linking with God. But in principle or in essence, it was something which is universal across various traditions. Yeah. So Maharaj, shall we move to specific value? I think we're already discussing rationality to some extent. So maybe we could take this forward and then we could move to other values like equality or individualism. So rationality with respect to rationality primarily applies to, say, on one side, the development of science, which leads to technology, which could be a separate subject. But science leads to, say, particular theories and particular ways of looking at the world, which may or may not be compatible with tradition, with the Bhakti tradition particularly now. So with respect to rationality, many of the biggest questions, now atheists may say that it is unscientific to believe in God, and theists may say that it is scientific, actually you can scientifically prove the existence of God. But broadly, we could say that on these kind of questions, rationality will never be never decisively conclusive. Like we say, Shastra Yonitvada Vedanta Sutra says. So for existence of God or existence of soul, we can give reasonable rational pointers for how these are possible. So where would rationality really come in conflict with bhakti? Would it come anywhere at all, or we could always bring about a harmony?
Do we have a dictionary definition of rationality? You have access to a quick search.
Yeah.
Because these are technical terms. So better equipped.
Can
we have the definition.
Yeah, so here it is. I shared my screen. The quality of being based or in accordance with reason and logic. Now,
say that again.
The quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. Now, if I go to Wikipedia.
Go on, read it.
Okay. Rationality implies the conformity of one's beliefs with one's reasons to believe and of one's actions with one's reasons for action. And to determine what behavior is the most rational, one needs to make several key assumptions and also need a logical formulation of the problem. So it's primarily based on logic or...
Let's just go to the first line. I think that much is enough for us. What is the first line of that definition? Based on logic and reason, right?
Yeah, that is where our thoughts and actions are based on logic and reason.
Yes.
Now the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the quality of being based on clear thought and reason, or making decisions based on clear thought and reason.
Right. Okay. So now, so when we say being rational, we say it's something that is based on logic and reason.
Yes.
And logic and reason are traits of the intelligence.
Yes.
Ability to analyze and understand things, reason out things, to logically analyze things is a trait of the intelligence. Now, from a purely intellectual point of view or a so-called rational point of view, there are an infinite number of explanations that could be given for any particular phenomenon. Right?
Okay.
You know, one could say just about anything. Now, for example, one could say that the apple has fallen to the earth because the apple wanted to fall, or because the apple didn't like the moon. Or, you know, one could make any number, an infinite number of explanations, each of which, in and of itself, is rational. But it is when you put all these rational statements together, you make a comprehensive, composite, consistent whole, that you get a philosophy, or you get a belief system. And therefore, all these statements like the apple fell because it wanted to fall, then we reject such statements because it doesn't fit in to other ideas. Then it's not really a reasonable philosophy.
Yeah.
So rationality, basically, because it is based on pure intelligence, it cannot again be the sole reason for us to achieve our goals in life, the true goals of life, from the spiritual point of view. Because ultimately, anything material will not give us perfection in and of itself. If purely material intelligence is used, then it will not give us perfection. But if that intelligence is dovetailed with spiritual knowledge, if that rationality, that logic, that power of reasoning is done in accordance with scripture, then that is perfect. The utilization of reason and logic, and that's what Kaviraj Goswami says in the Chaitanya Charan Prabhu also. So I think we are not against logic per se. We are not against rationality per se. We are against these things being employed independent of scriptural conclusions.
Yeah, I think this would weigh for those who are rationalists. Yes, Maharaj. For rationalists, this could be a problem because they consider rationality to be the supreme authority. And they would want to subject even scripture to rational scrutiny. And they may accept certain aspects of scripture that they think are rational. And there are certain aspects of scripture which they would consider as not rational, and they would reject that. And in that sense, rationality will become a authority higher than scripture for them. So sometimes I differentiate between three levels: that there is rational, there is irrational, and there is trans-rational. So irrational is where that which does not stand rational scrutiny, but trans-rational is where rational scrutiny itself doesn't stand. because the subjects are so expansive that rationality itself does not work. And this positing of trans-rational is itself not necessarily irrational, because anybody who works in a creative field, for example, say Einstein himself said that the intuitive mind is the real discoverer. I'm paraphrasing, and the rational mind is a mere servant. So, for example, the phenomena of inspiration, which leads to major breakthroughs in all fields, especially science, which is considered as eminently based on rationality. So inspiration is not based simply on a linear, rational progression of from what I know to what I now know, what I knew to what I know. It is a sudden leap, which sometimes it is a cognitive leap in understanding that comes suddenly, but the rational basis for that may take decades to be arrived at. Like Gauss proposed things which were accepted and used, but the proof came decades after he passed away. Gauss was a electrical scientist. So, so in that sense, we could talk about scripture accepts rationality, but scripture also recognizes that there is a domain of reality beyond rationality. That's the trans-rational.
Yes, and I think it is not rational to assert that this is not possible.
Yes. So rationality could be associated with humility. That's this.
Yeah, there is no rational reason to posit that reality, there cannot be a section of reality or aspect of reality that is beyond our power of rationality, that is beyond our intellectual and sensory examination. To posit, therefore, that reality is what my senses perceive, that reality is limited to the range of my power of reasoning, doesn't necessarily hold water. It is not in and of itself a rational thing. It doesn't necessarily pass the test of rationality. So why should the universe be such that it should only come within the grasp of your power of reasoning and rationality?
Yes, Maharaj.
So it is an irrational assertion to make that there is an aspect of reality that is beyond the powers of our senses and the power of our reasoning.
Yes, Maharaj.
And because our power is based on the senses, and the power of the senses is limited, so our reasoning power is also limited because it's based only on the senses and the mind and the intelligence.
Yes, Maharaj, this is true. In Western intellectual thought, there were thinkers like Kant and Hume and others. So this is an active discussion. So what happened was there are some rationalists who said that only the rational is real, and that led to a wholesale rejection of religion and God and all those things. But there were other thinkers who said no, there could be all these which are beyond the domain of rationality. But the result of that was they said that the rational is what we can mutually agree on. Even if there is something which is beyond the domain of reason, that is that you experience something, you believe something, I experience something, I believe something. That would be different for different people. And what these thinkers did was they tried to create space for religion within the age of reason by shifting religion from the public sphere to the private domain. So the idea is, okay, you have had some experience, you have certain beliefs, that's fine for you. So religion became more of a subjective experience than an objective reality. So any thoughts on this, Maharaj?
Yes. At the end of the day, if one really goes deeper into that, everything is ultimately a subjective experience. If you really want, if they really want to go deeper into it, their so-called rational understanding of the world is also a subjective experience. It's only that their subjective experiences agree. That's all. That is their understanding of rationality. So if they define rationality as something,
can you just explain this? Say, for example, if I measure this and say I say it's 2 inches.
yeah,
So now, is this a subjective experience or is this objective reality? Independent of what I say or you say. So what do you mean by everything?
It's still your experience.
No, but you can also have the same experience. You can also take a scale and you can measure it and you will find the measure to be the same. So I'd like to understand what you mean by this.
Yes, it is just that the subjective experiences of many of us coincide because we're coming from the same frame of reference. And so we call that as rationality. So if you define which we all commonly agree upon, because we observe something, but our senses, as we know from our basic Krishna conscious teachings, our senses are imperfect. We have a tendency to be illusioned. We make mistakes. We have a tendency to cheat. Okay, so at the gross physical level, what we agree upon is relatively easier to deal with.
Okay, yeah.
But when you start getting into a domain that is increasingly out of range of your sensory perception, either at the macro level or at the micro level, then we have problems.
Yes. In fact, to reiterate, yeah.
Sorry?
Just to reiterate this point, actually,
yes,
not just beyond sensory experience, even the essential sensory experience, it's not objective. In the sense that when the age of science started, science decided to divide observed reality into what they called as objective primary qualities and secondary qualities. So primary qualities are those which are measurable. Like I mentioned this, the length, breadth, velocity, viscosity, luminosity, all these. So those which you can put a mathematical measure to, they call those as primary properties. And everything that could not be put a mathematical measure on was called a secondary. And science systematically subordinates or neglects all secondary properties. So even within sensory experience, say when we eat food, the taste of the food, that is not mathematically measurable. So I may say this is delicious, and you may say it's okay. So I might say this painting is astonishing, and somebody else might say it is mediocre. So I agree with this point that, or I'm emphasizing on this point itself that even sensory experience, the essence of what we look at is not the mathematical parameters. It's taste, smell, the visual appeal, so of the form, the visual appeal. So all these are not mathematically measurable. So in that sense, a strict rationality, a strictly rational, or rather here, again, these are big philosophical subjects, objectivity and rationality, what is their relationship? But as you said, the domain of the purely objective is so limited that we humans couldn't live in that domain. The completely, the starkly objective domain without any subjective experience is not the world that we live in. So many of so if a person A falls in love with person B, then A finds the person B lovable, but a mother finds her baby eminently lovable and is ready to give up anything for that baby. Some other woman may not want to do that. And this subjective experience is often the basis of our human relationships, and it is also critical for human society. So I agree, the objective reality is not the complete reality. I agree with you on that part, Maharaj.
Because you see, the fundamental is based on sensory perception and the extensions of the senses. And among the senses, I also include the mind and the intelligence. So therefore, there is bound to be defective conclusion. There are bound to be mistakes, you see. And as I mentioned earlier, rationality is easier to deal with or to accept when it is in the realm of everyday affairs.
Okay.
But when you go, into more rarefied realms of reality, which are not so accessible directly by our senses, then where is the question of rationality?
Yes.
Where is that common meeting ground? That common meeting ground is also on some rarefied stratum of some speculation or some inference or something like that. So the point is that if sensory perception, if intelligence, if the mind are trained to express themselves and function on the platform of scriptural teachings, then they will attain perfection. We are not denying sensory perception or rationality or intelligence or the function of the mind, lock, stock, and barrel. We are not rejecting that. All we are saying is dovetail that with the conclusion of the scripture.
Yes, Maharaj.
So let the rationality and the logic and everything be based on scriptural logic. For example, Prabhupada used to say, right, that use your science to prove that God exists. Include. So the scriptural conclusion is that there is a supreme intelligence behind this creation. So now we use our rationality to understand how that is so. We use our logic and intelligence to establish how that is so. So that is how I believe rationality and logic and intelligence have a role in our life, and we're not rejecting it. But I think we're more or less deviating from the main theme of our
from modernity,
which is, Bhakti is a pro anti-modern.
Yes, Maharaj.
So if we can just get back to that, I think we went on in this direction because the point came up about how modern philosophies were based on critical analysis of tradition and on the subsequent rejection of tradition, because they were seeing everything in the light of rationality and the functioning of the intelligence. That's how we came to this point, right?
Yes,
and
Maharaj.
we started talking about rationality.
Yes, Maharaj.
So now coming back to the question of Bhakti, in the midst of this turbulent ocean of ever-changing and conflicting philosophies of life, So if we come back to answering the question of Bhakti, is it pro-modern or is it anti-modern? So in the light of all that we're talking about now, can we come back and assess this topic?
Yes, Maharaj. One way we could say is that Bhakti is trans-modern because it is eternal. So it is the connection of the soul with the Supreme, and it transcends all temporary historical phenomena. So, but within modernity, we could discern some things which are pro-modern. So some things which can actually facilitate or help in the growth of Bhakti, and some things which could impede the growth of Bhakti. So I think that instead of making a generic statement of Bhakti and modernity, we'll need to look at specific elements of modernity and how they interact with bhakti. But in essence, bhakti is not modern, bhakti is not ancient, bhakti is not medieval. Bhakti is transcendental. And bhakti can be the soul's longing for the divine is something which is inherent to the soul. And in that sense, it can manifest in any historical milieu.
Yes, yes, exactly. The word modern or ancient, take that to be the acronym for modern, are essentially temporal constructs, right? By temporal,
Yes.
I mean time related.
Yes.
Related to the phenomenon of time. Whereas Bhagavad Gita, for example, if you take that as the standard book of spiritual wisdom, is not so related to time, in the sense that the basic principles of the Bhagavad Gita don't change with time.
Yes.
So, and we read that in the Bhagavad Gita itself, where Krishna says he first spoke the sun god. He spoke to the sun god, millions and millions of years ago. He spoke then. Vivaswan, the sun god, spoke to his son Manu millions of years ago. Then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spoke this 500 years ago. Prabhupada spoke this about 50 years ago, right? So the essence of all that was spoken is the same. So that has not changed. So as you rightly said, we cannot use terms like modern, because time in the material world is limiting.
Yes.
So any temporal construct will be limiting. And to impose the limits of such a temporal construction on something that is eternal is not valid.
Yes.
Therefore, to say whether bhakti is pro-modern or anti-modern is something that is not appropriate. It's not appropriate to talk about such things. However, here I'll just make a distinction between philosophy and culture, and maybe we can look at it in the light of philosophy and culture. If we look at philosophy as our foundational understanding of the reality, of the nature of reality, of the nature of the self, of the nature of God, and of the interrelationships between these, then we can perhaps call that as philosophy.
Okay.
And the manifestation of philosophy at the level of the mind, the mental attitudes, of behavior, of lifestyle, all that we would call as culture.
Okay.
And so because culture ultimately reflects the philosophy of life, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy finds expression in culture, and culture is a reflection or a manifestation of philosophy at the mental, physical, behavioral level.
Okay.
Now, for each of these, I'll say there are philosophical principles that are eternally valid. So they're not under the influence of time. Say, for example, we are the soul, eternal soul. That's a philosophical principle that we follow, we believe in. Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is the origin of all the material and spiritual worlds. The material world goes through a cycle of creation, sustenance, and destruction. The spiritual world exists eternally beyond the realm of the material world. Right? These are certain things that we as devotees understand and firmly believe to be true and valid at all times. So whether it was millions of years ago, whether it is now, these things are true, right? Now, so even in the modern era, the postmodern era, pre-modern era, they're all true. So now if you use the word, is bhakti, pro-modern or anti-modern, then one could also interpret that to see whether the beliefs, the foundational philosophical beliefs are also in alignment with modern understanding.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
one could apply a similar test to the cultural aspects.
Yes.
So for us, these philosophical principles are eternally valid, and there's no question of subjecting it to the temporal criteria like ancient or modern.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, people today may not accept that there is a God.
Yes.
Or even if they accept there is a God, they may not accept that Krishna, his name is Krishna, or they may not accept that the material world is created, sustained, and destroyed, and the cycle goes on eternally. So the principles of the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita for us are eternally valid, but to what degree does the modern world accept these philosophical principles? I guess you could look at it in that light, whether it's pro-modern or modern. That's one way of looking at it. Another, and the same argument or the perspective could be applied to culture.
Yes.
So whether the attitudinal or mental or the behavioral aspects of culture, the lifestyle aspects of culture are in alignment with the modern understanding or beliefs, right?
Yes, Maharaj. I think this is what we did is initially we started with, say, maybe analyzing modernity and what its components are to see how much they are in harmony with bhakti. Now we are in some sense analyzing the components of bhakti and then seeing how modernity would view them. So I would say that, yeah. So as far as the philosophy is concerned, the existence of God, the existence of soul, existence of even say that the cyclic understanding of the universe. Basically, I think the essential propositions of bhakti would be that there is a soul, that we are essentially spiritual and eternal, that there is a supreme eternal divinity, and there's a relationship of love between the two. So we could say that a rational case can be made for all three of these. Not all rationalists will accept it, but and nobody can actually dismiss these as irrational, because we have a longing for eternity. And how do we explain that from a biological perspective, the or from a scientific perspective? That longing is very much there. And similarly, there is a search for ultimate reality, and also the longing to love and be loved. So I think we could say that the core truths of bhakti, we could make us not just a reasonable but a strong rational case for them if it was required. And the more, sorry.
See that they do not, many, or by they I mean many people would not accept that to be rational. Because in their thinking, this is not logical, it is not provable from their point of view, not scientifically validated. So even though we may present it as being rational, which we do, when we present Krishna consciousness, we always present it like that.
Yeah.
But many people today may not accept that. The modern thinking largely today does not accept that. Also, although there is a section that is interested in spirituality in the West, it's coming up, into meditation and all that. But to what degree will modern thinking overall as a category align with our bhakti principles, philosophical principles, is something we don't know.
Yes.
And then the alignment is naturally, especially in the last many years, the alignment is not quite good, because modern thinking differs substantially with our philosophical principles. While
Yes,
many
ma'am.
people do agree, there are many people who don't agree.
Yeah.
Similarly, with the cultural aspects also, we have the same difficulty.
Yeah, so actually, I agree, I fully agree with you that, if we talk about some organizations, they call themselves as rationalist organizations, and often rationalist is just a more acceptable way of saying atheist. So
Yeah.
many of the rationalist organizations are atheistic, but just as we cannot make if you say that somebody can't make a very strong case for a case that will be widely accepted for theism, then actually one cannot make a very strong case even for atheism. Although in the mainstream perception, it is thought that to be rational means to be atheistic, but it's not that simple, because rationality doesn't necessarily lead to any decisive conclusion about the nature of ultimate reality. So rationality, so in that, but I agree with you that, so we could say that as devotees, we do need to, considering modern thought processes, the first way we present ourselves is make a rational case, not a scriptural case. In the pre-modern times, we could just use scriptural authority, so to present, to reason towards certain conclusions, but we will need to approach to rationality. And so in that sense, it is, we don't accept rationality completely, or don't accept the conclusions that are often associated with rationality, but the process of rational thinking is something which would be indispensable for us if we want to communicate with the broad variety of people who call themselves as modern.
Yes, and that is precisely how Srila Prabhupada presented it.
Yes.
If you look at his conversations and even his lectures, he emphasized the rational or logical aspect of believing in the soul.
Yes.
He's like the Dehinos Pinyatha Deha, so you're changing one, your body is always changing. Where is that body when you were a child? You had one body, now you have another body, you change your body. So there is appeal to reason, there is appeal to logic, there is appeal to the intellect. And when Prabhupada was presenting Krishna consciousness, even when it came to belief in the scriptures, he made a logical or a rational case for it. Like, when you want to know, a child wants to know who his father is, the best way is to ask the mother. So the mother is like the Vedas. So we understand who God is because that is standard information, an authoritative source. So he reasoned out things. So he never started his lectures simply by telling people you must believe in this because it's there in the Bhagavad Gita. Eventually he did, but he made a case for doing that. So come back to the original point I made earlier that, we are not against logic, we're not against rationality, we're not against the use of intelligence, etc. But all we are saying is align it with the teachings of the Vedas, of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes.
Then that leads to perfection because you have your anchor.
Okay. So by align, what exactly do you mean? That means use the rationality to understand these truths, or consider to understand the Bhagavad Gita's truths, or align means subordinate. So align, what exactly do you mean by align means utilize or subordinate, or both?
Both. In the beginning, we align our intelligence and rationality to understand the truths of Vedic statements.
Okay.
The soul, the existence of the soul. So we understand the logic. We understand the need to believe in the scripture.
Yeah.
Of course, logic and reason are not the only ways we can develop that Shraddha. That Shraddha comes from other people who have Shraddha. But that's another topic, it's another principle.
Yeah.
But we have to go through this whole process of exploration, of discovery, of probing, of inquiry, right?
Yes,
So then, see, all of us who come to Bhakti, we go through this whole process.
yes.
Someone explains to us, whether it's in Prabhupada's books and or someone else gives it to us in a personal discussion or a lecture about why the soul exists, and then we become convinced about it, and then our faith increases as time goes by.
Yes.
So by aligning of the intellect and our reasoning capacity and our rationality with the Vedic teachings, I mean that we use these faculties to understand the truths of the Vedic statements and to develop some degree of faith in them so that we can begin the practice of devotional activities, which then strengthens our faith further. And then we begin to use logic and rationality to present this to others and to establish it in the eyes of the world.
Okay.
So that they also see it as being logical and rational and reasonable. Say, for example, the belief in God, which is more rational, that something came out of nothing or something came out of something.
Yes.
Or let's say everything came out of nothing or everything came out of something.
Yes, that's true.
Which is more rational?
Yes, Maharaj. So
make a case, a rational case, as you would say.
So I think we could apply this principle that we used about rationality for other values also, for equality or for, say, freedom. Now, these are important, but we cannot absolutize them. Absolutizing them would basically lead to them self-destroying. So we could go in that direction briefly and look at each of these values if you want, maybe for a few minutes, or we could go in that other direction which you mentioned about culture. Because for most people, when they think about modernity, they think of more in terms of modes of living. Maybe the houses in which we live, the kind of roads we have, the kind of dresses we wear. So modernity is more associated for most people in terms of lifestyle, culture, those things rather than thought processes. So do you want to discuss the thought processes a bit more, or should we go to values now, go to the cultural aspect?
In my understanding, culture has two aspects: an internal aspect and an external aspect.
Okay.
The internal aspect would comprise the beliefs, the values, the attitudes,
okay, yes,
mindsets, the ambitions, the desires,
yes,
all of those. And that is based upon the philosophy of life. So, right,
okay.
I spoke of philosophy and culture.
Like you said, culture is the manifestation of philosophy. Yeah.
Yes. So the philosophy is the foundational understanding of reality, of the self, God, etc. That is reflected first at the subtler level in attitudes, mindsets, ambitions, desires, aspirations, etc. And then those attitudes and mindsets and desires then are reflected at the gross level, at the external level, in terms of our lifestyle, in terms of our behavior, and so on.
Okay.
So the internal and external aspects together comprise culture. That is the way I would understand it.
Okay. Yeah, just taking this point forward now. So, so we could have philosophy is more at the domain of thoughts and attitudes, if we can broadly classify that, what people think of culture is more in terms of practices, although there is an internal aspect which arises from philosophy, but there may not necessarily be a one-to-one correspondence that this philosophy would necessarily lead to this culture. Say, for example, in India itself, broadly, there was a spiritual philosophy that everyone accepted. Everybody accepted that there is soul, there is God. But at the same time, within the Indian subcontinent itself, there is a remarkable amount of diversity. And this was there even if you consider the times of the Mahabharata, where the different kingdoms had different modes of living, even modes of worship. So in that sense, we could say that even if bhakti is associated with certain philosophy, and that philosophy can express itself through varieties of cultures. It needn't be just one culture. Even the bhakti culture in, say, Maharashtra is different from the bhakti culture in Karnataka, or definitely different from in Bengal or Uttar Pradesh. So maybe we could look at culture as more like not one culture, but like a cultural circumference. So what aspects of bhakti culture work well with modernity, and what aspects of bhakti culture we may not be able to, we may have to insist that for practicing bhakti culture we may have to create a distance from modern norms.
Right. Before that, I'd just like to clarify that when we speak of philosophy and culture, I don't mean these to be mutually exclusive categories. You know,
Of course.
they're actually one integrated whole.
Okay.
They like bhakti. We have a bhakti philosophy, but we also have a bhakti culture.
Yes.
And that, say humility. Humility, is it culture? Is it philosophy? It's both.
Yeah.
Because the Bhagavad Gita, our Vedic teachings, teach us both the foundational theoretical principles. They teach us the subtler aspects of the internal culture, and they also teach us about the gross aspects or the external aspects of that culture. It's all one integrated whole.
Yes. Okay.
And therefore, and also within that, the cultural aspects will be, as you rightly said, expressed differently in different lands, in different eras.
Yeah.
But the basic principles will be the same.
Yes.
Broad principles, at least.
Yes, man, that's an interesting point. So, of course, philosophy and culture are not two, we could say, non-intersecting wholes, non-intersecting circles with a causal link between them, but they are not exactly identical also. Say, for example, we could say Advaitavadis and Bhaktas both may culturally worship the deities, but their philosophy is quite different. So there would be some aspects which could fall, so we could say it's more like a Venn diagram where there are two circles, there are major intersections, but there are some things which may fall more in the domain of philosophy and they may be outside the domain of culture. And there will be something which may focus more on the domain of culture and fall more in the domain of culture and may not be within the domain of philosophy. But definitely they are connected. They're not completely disconnected.
In fact, I would say go to the extent of saying they are an integrated, deeply interwoven kind of their phenomena. You really can't separate philosophy from culture many times. I gave the example of humility. Now, is humility only an external behavioral thing?
Okay, I get where you're coming from, Maharaj. Yeah.
Humility at the subtle level of culture, or is it also a philosophical principle?
Yeah, I agree with you, Maharaj. Okay, maybe then you mentioned the word cultural expressions. So I was thinking of that in terms of cultures. So humility, we could say, is a universal human value, but we might express it by folding our hands. Say Japanese people might express it by bowing at the waist, or somebody might actually physically bow down, or somebody might salute. So now we could call these as different cultural expressions, or we could call these as different cultures itself, because Japanese culture and Indian culture are different. So in that sense, when I was talking about from one philosophy as a circle, we could have different cultures coming out, but maybe we could use the word different cultural expressions coming out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. One could alternatively also use the terms principles and details.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, the principle being the essential feature of something, a fundamental feature of something. So the essential or fundamental feature of something could be the principle.
Yeah.
And the way the essential or fundamental principle is expressed or finds expression at the mental, physical, and social level, etc., or at the level of time, place, and circumstance, that you could call a detail.
Okay.
Yes. So, for example, let's take the case of humility, since that point came up, that humility is a principle.
Okay.
Yes. It is derived from another philosophical principle that we are insignificant, we are tiny parts and parcels of Krishna. We are not the controllers, we are always controlled. And therefore, there is a strong ontological and philosophical basis for acting humble.
Yes.
Right? So, humility is a philosophical principle. It is also a cultural principle at the level of the mind. And then the humility is a principle, it's a cultural principle, it's a philosophical principle, it's even a behavioral principle. But the detail is how you express that humility. You may do it by bowing down, you may do it by offering obeisances, by folding your hands, by your words, right?
Yes, Maharaj. Now, just to complicate this a little bit, when we talk about a principle, it may not necessarily be associated with one philosophy alone. Say, for example, the scientific worldview, often they argued that the scientific worldview fosters humility more than the Christian worldview, because one of the arguments there was Christianity considered humanity to be special, that the earth is the center of the universe and humans are meant for deliverance. And the scientific worldview says that actually we are just evolved animals, and the ego that had separated us from the rest of the world, so that is destroyed by science. So now whether this reasoning is true or not is open to question, but the point is that there could be different philosophies which also lead or claim to lead to certain values. So that means there is a philosophy. Within philosophy, there are many aspects. There are statements about the nature of reality, but there are also statements about how we approach that reality. So within philosophy, there's ontology. So ontology is the nature of reality, and then there is another field, ethics. So how are we meant to behave in nature in relationship with reality? So that's just to nuance the subject, but I think we can move forward. And so you were talking about diverse cultural expressions.
Yeah. So, I'll just make a comment on what you said now, that scientists also, assert that by study of science, they have become humble, because the study of science would necessarily lead to humility.
Yes.
By whatever reasonings they do it, actually it should, because when you look at the vastness and the complexity of the whole universe, every intelligent person should become humble, right? And you realize how insignificant, we are individually in the midst of this gigantic cosmos. and how incapable we are of grasping anything and how helpless we are, right? And the coronavirus thing is showing us that. So that kind of an intellectualization or rational approach can lead us to become humble, as it should. That is a proper use of intelligence.
Okay.
We can become humble by this form of reasoning. However, the point is that material rationalization and the intellect cannot lead to a sustenance of such qualities.
Okay.
Your intelligence cannot, it can make you humble for a time being, but it cannot keep you humble and ensure that you will attain to the perfection of humility. Whereas the spiritual approach is, not only do you intellectually understand your position, philosophically, ontologically, and therefore you understand you must be humble, but by taking to spiritual practices, you actually become humble in course of time as you advance spiritually. So it is not merely an intellectual approach. So you actualize what is an intellectual conclusion.
Yes.
By spiritual practice. Whereas by the purely intellectual or scientific approach, it just remains an intellectual thing. And if some scientist does become humble, it's more because of his swabhava, his fundamental nature of being in the mode of goodness or something like that.
Yes.
Rather than just on the strength of the scientific philosophy.
Yes, Maharaj. I think this is one major lacking in Western philosophy, that most of our modern Western philosophy, or even little pre-modern, it has been divorced from any systematic practice, that I may posit this or that, but there is no means for purification and transformation. So just the intellectual reasoning is not enough to transform.
Yes.
And our philosophy gives us a set of tools by which actually the heart becomes purified. And then even if I intellectually understand I should be humble, but to purge the ego or the pride from the heart, that's not just an intellectual process, that's more of a purificatory process. And those resources are important.
Yes.
Yes, Maharaj.
And to look at it from the point of view of Bhagavad Gita philosophy, even if a scientist is very humble now, because by his scientific studies, he has come to that conclusion, which is good. But there's no guarantee that he'll continue to be humble in the next life. That would depend a lot on his other karma and many other things.
Okay.
That will sustain or not. So such conclusions that are driven by intellectual considerations are not transformational, and they are not sustainable. Whereas spiritual values, or the spiritual approach, will not only actualize them, it will transform the heart, and it will be sustainable, and eventually it will become an eternal thing.
Yes. So when that verse says Harava bhaktasya kuto mahadguna, it does that where are the good qualities in those who are not devoted? It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any good qualities. It means that their qualities are not going to be sustainable. They are there today and they may disappear tomorrow.
They are superficial.
Yes.
Because they are not in connection with the Supreme.
Yes, that is true.
With spiritual reality or spiritual knowledge.
Yes, Maharaj. Yes. So maybe we can come back to, this is an important detour we had, but so there is philosophy and there is culture. So I was mentioning the point that for most people, modernity, they evaluate it, they perceive it in terms of certain cultural aspects of dress or technology or comforts. So if we look at that aspect of modernity, so in one sense, we have the principle of Yukta Vairagya, where technology can be used. So would you like to elaborate on this aspect?
Of the modern aspect of the modern understanding of culture as being largely external, relating to dress and the other
Yes.
external things.
So,
Again, Chaitanya Charan Prabhu, I would come back to my original point that the the lifestyle and the behavior
okay.
are ultimately expressions of our attitudes and mindsets.
So what you are saying is this, if I may rephrase it.
Let's
So if
address.
yeah, so if I understand what you're saying is that bhakti is more about inner values, and if those inner values are there, then the appropriate cultural expressions will come out. So rather than trying to evaluate or legislate particular cultural expressions, we can focus on educating so that the proper values come up.
Yes. So
I
this the basic philosophical framework or foundational teachings,
hmm,
who are we, who is God, starting from all of that, that will eventually change the mindset or the mentality of an individual, which in turn will change its external expression.
yes, Maharaj. I remember long ago, many years ago, you had mentioned this to me that, say, for example, modesty in dressing. That was a universal principle. The specific dress that people might wear in different cultures might have been different, but basically a dress that properly covers the body in a dignified way. So you could say that. So that is the cultural value we are talking about. So,
Yes.
so the specific expression is not so much a matter of issue; it's the fundamental value.
Yes, but that value will express itself in the externals. So,
Yes.
coming to dress, for example, let's relate it to the internal value.
Okay.
So, in the beginning of our discussion, we spoke about um, the individual, the individual expression, the primacy of the individual, right?
Okay.
The modern culture, modern philosophy, basically gives inordinate emphasis to the individual and to individual rights, isn't it?
Yes.
So when that becomes your driving value, then it automatically finds expression in your lifestyle and your externals. Then you will say, well, it's my right to dress the way I want. I can do whatever I want. I can eat whatever I want. I can dress in whichever way I want. Why should anyone question me on that? Why should there be any restrictions on that? So the lifestyle is an indication of what's here, what's in our mind.
Okay.
So the modern, see, before uh, this modern emphasis on the primacy of the individual became dominant, there was modesty of dress in the traditional cultures of the world.
Hmm.
Okay, but the moment the value shifted and emphasized the individual inordinately, disproportionately, then the individual started thinking like that. Well, I'm the most important person. It's all about me. I'm not worried about society. I'm not worried, it doesn't really matter. Social mores, social norms, they're not so important. For me, it's all about me. I want to dress the way I like. I want to eat the way I like, right?
Hmm.
Therefore, the lifestyles and the behavioral aspects of culture are reflections of the mindsets. And the mindsets are what they are because of the philosophy of life that they have, which may be agnostic, which may be atheistic, which may be whatever.
Hmm.
So the root is the philosophical education. And we go there and we teach Krishna consciousness in its basic elements. And gradually people start understanding what to eat, how to dress, how to not dress. All these things will automatically come, isn't it?
Okay. Yes. It's like again, uh, we instead of trying to cut the weeds, we try to first of all uproot them or understand, what are the seeds that are causing these weeds to come up. and we go to the root. So yeah, so there are something healthy about modernity, something unhealthy about modernity. But instead of simply evaluating that, because that can lead to the conflicts over infringement on people's freedom. So instead of simply talking about freedom and debating that, we can go at a fundamental level and ask, what is freedom meant for? See, is freedom itself the supreme value? Is freedom meant to do something of value? And then if through the Bhakti philosophy we establish what is of value, then a regulation of freedom, so that that which is of value could be attained, that will become acceptable. But if we directly focus on, this should not be done, this should be done, then it can backfire. So I think this is what you are suggesting is a much more approach which is subtler, but it's also likely to be more appealing to people who are influenced by modernity, to not let their modern perceptions come in the way of their at least open-mindedly exploring bhakti.
Yes. So, if you have the philosophical understanding, and then you have the external cultural expression,
Yes.
there is an intermediate stage of the internal cultural expression of the philosophy. That is where sometimes there is a gap. So that devotees may also then maybe dress in a certain way or act in a, to wear. So we have to explain. Even a devotee may argue, well, what's wrong with me going out and, let's say, eating in a restaurant or something? What's wrong with that? So that means there's something there. There's some gap. There is a lack of internalization, right? So if somebody is dressing in a certain way, let's say, then why is it so? Why is that person dressing in that way? There is a philosophy, there's a mindset that goes with it, right? So maybe if it's a devotee also, let's say, that the devotee is a nice devotee chanting 16 rounds, or maybe it has faith in Krishna, but there is a disconnect. The external cultural expression, of dress or food habits or something, there is a disconnect somehow. So there is a gap. So therefore, these discussions on the cultural aspect, I think, will be important for us also.
Okay. So what you are saying is that if the external cultural expression is say radically divergent from what is the norm, and then although that person is also accepting the philosophy, then that's where the internal cultural values may not have actually developed, or may not be blossom, may not be there that way.
Or there may be a lack of appreciation for that, or a lack of appreciation of how that how that external thing connects to the philosophy. The inability to see the connection.
Okay.
I mean, why is my way of dressing, connected to my devotion to Krishna? So, say if somebody is very inappropriately dressed and says that, well, it's just about me thinking about Krishna, I can just chant,
Okay. So by inappropriately, you don't necessarily mean a particular, say, like a Indian dress, or inappropriately means immodest.
Then we come to the issue of principles and details.
Okay, it makes sense.
As much as philosophy has principles and details, the culture also has principles and details, right?
Okay, yes.
Say, for example, dress is has principles. There are principles to dress. That dress should be sattvic. It should be in the mode of goodness. It's a principle.
Yes, Maharaj.
Now that principle may be expressed, in different ways. So when it's expressed in the temple, then we have one kind of dress. When it's expressed when, let's say, a grihastha is going to work in the office, so that person will have to wear, what we call karmi dress, maybe trousers and shirt or something, but that has to be sattvic.
So if they are going for a marriage ceremony or something like that, there might be a slightly different dress, maybe a more festive kind of dress. Okay.
Yeah. So when I meant inappropriate, I meant not sattvic.
Okay.
Or if somebody is dressed in a very unclean way, that is tamasic.
Okay.
So another principle of dress, because it's connected to sattvic, is cleanliness. It should be presentable. It should be clean.
Yes.
So these are the principles of dress, and the detail is whether you're wearing a dhoti kurta or whether you're wearing a trouser. At the same time, I want to say, since we're on the topic, that as a detail, it is not important. We should not confuse details and importance. Something may be a detail, but it's still something very important.
Interesting.
We may adjust it according to time, place, and circumstance.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's still very important because it has a bearing. It does affect us. It does affect our consciousness and so on.
Yes, Maharaj. So,
one devotee was telling me that their children who have grown up in the West, they feel embarrassed when their parents dress in the dress like dhoti kurta or a sari or something. Why do you dress?
Okay.
Because they feel embarrassed or awkward that their parents are dressing like that. And there could also situations when the parents feel like that about their children. I know one devotee who was complaining that his parents complain when he wears a dhoti.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the Indian parents, yes, they complain. So there are situations. So there is some clarity needed on this. The details, the principles, internal, external expressions of culture and how they tie up to the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. And then how it all eventually relates to being pro-modern or anti-modern. Someone may see wearing a dhoti kurta as being anti-modern. Someone may see it as being cool. Someone may see it as being traditional.
Yeah.
It's
that's true. So, Maharaj, could we say that by these sort of the kind of discussions that we have had, these are meant to provide individual devotees tools for practicing bhakti in modernity? That rather than saying that bhakti and modernity are fully agreeable or fully opposite, what we say is that we need to understand what is bhakti, and then we appropriately practice bhakti within the modern context. So there are some areas in which conflict might be inevitable, but we don't want to maximize the conflict unnecessarily. So when we understand that certain, like you said, the details, they could be adjusted, so we can avoid unnecessary conflict, but we can't compromise on bhakti principles in order to avoid a conflict with modernity. But through such discussions, devotees can get the resources, some thought intellectual resources, we could say, by which they can individually navigate their journey through modernity. And if we have that sincerity, Krishna will provide the guidance from within, as Krishna says, Tadami buddhi yogam tam yenamam upayantite. So in specific situations, a devotee may have to turn towards Krishna in the heart. Okay, how do I behave in this situation? What do I do in this situation? But so would that be like some concluding? You would like to give something concluding, Maharaj, or you want to speak something more?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nuanced thing. How to practice bhakti in the modern age, and there are so many areas of interface with the outside world. Area of dress, area of food, area of entertainment, area of, so many things. So we are influenced and affected by the outside world because we're living within it. So how does that interaction take place? So to what degree do we need the internal and external expressions of culture to safeguard our bhakti? So these are things. And to what degree is the deeper understanding of the philosophical aspects also integral to the protection of our bhakti? When and to what degree can the cultural expressions be modified? See, these are the questions that we need to think about and discuss more.
Yes, Maharaj. So, should I summarize, Maharaj, or you would like to add something more? Yeah. So we discussed on the topic of bhakti, pro-modern, anti-modern, and we took modernity. We started with what is modernity. We could discuss different areas of life such as politics, economics, but we focus more on values and say freedom, individualism, equality, rationality. So we took I think we devoted substantial time to rationality and how ati sarvatra varjayat, you said that if rationality is made into the supreme value, that self-critical attitude, the attitude of questioning and rejecting tradition, that has led to the modern cancel culture, and it'll go on destroying whatever has come before it, and that's endless. And that happened in European history also, where the Protestants kept endlessly dividing because they rejected authority. And so then we discussed that rationality itself is compatible with the principles of bhakti, in the sense that we can make a rational case and we can also use rationality. So aligning rationality means that we utilize rationality to explain and to understand spiritual truths, and then we use it to explain spiritual truths to others. So at the same time, those who become purely devoted to rationality, they will reject everything else as irrational, and they will reject spiritual truths also as irrational. But we could differentiate between irrational and trans-rational, and rationality itself can't disprove the existence of trans-rationality. So there is in modern thought the attempt to make, say, the trans-rational or the spiritual subjective rather than objective. Then we discussed about how, in one sense, our fundamental experiences are subjective, not objective. So as we move from grosser, mathematically measurable to intangible, then they become more and more subjective. So the Bhakti tradition offers us certain resources by which different subjects can have the same higher spiritual experiences. In that sense, there can be an objectivity, that there is a shared subjective experiences could be called as objective. And so then after discussing how rationality can be used, or rationality can be harmonized, aligned with spirituality, with bhakti, then we move to the other side, looking at the components of bhakti with respect to philosophy and then culture. And then the core propositions of bhakti philosophy can be a rational case could be made for presenting them, but the rationality alone taken as a two extreme will not be compatible. And then you made a very significant differentiation with analysis of the relationship between philosophy and culture, that they are, we could say, organically related with each other. And the philosophy is more like the foundational worldview. Then there is an inner expression of the culture, there is an internal dimension of the culture in terms of values, and there is an outer expression of the culture. So there are many permutations possible. Let's say somebody can have a non-theistic philosophy and they can have the value of humility. Somebody can have theistic philosophy and have the value of humility. But non-theistic philosophies the values will not be sustainable among those who have it. And the non-theistic philosophies don't provide transformational tools for the development of those values in those who don't have it right now. But the theistic philosophies do. And then we talked about the external aspects of the culture, external expressions, which may vary. So how humility and modesty, for example, or dietary choices are expressed may vary from culture to culture. But if the fundamental values are assimilated, and our education can focus more on, not on specific practices and debating them, because that can seem to be infringing on freedom, but on establishing the importance of those values, then devotees will have some resources to navigate modernity. And if we have at a level individual sincerity, then Krishna will guide us from within. And these are, as you said, nuanced issues with what can be adjusted, what can't be adjusted. And also you mentioned that just because something is detailed, it doesn't mean it is not important. So we can't just casually neglect the details. We may have to seriously consider how those details are to be adjusted, but not that they simply be rejected. So bhakti, so the overall we could say that it's nuanced, the interaction with bhakti and modernity. And bhakti ultimately is transcendental. So it's not anti-modern, pro-modern, it is trans-modern, because bhakti is an eternal relationship of the soul with Krishna. And modernity is, as you said, a temporal construct. So how that transcendental expression of the human heart can be expressed in modernity, that would be something which would be both an individual and an institutional journey for us to navigate. Any concluding thoughts or anything I left out, Maharaj?
Yeah, just one point, I think, that while we emphasize that inherently bhakti is transcendental and therefore not subject to terms like modern or ancient, because it is beyond time. At the same time, certain philosophical understandings or cultural expressions may not be aligned to contemporary beliefs and practices.
Yes.
Some may be aligned, some may not be aligned. So at one level, we say that the question of bhakti being pro or anti-modern is infructuous. But on the other hand, we say that the principles and the practices of bhakti may be aligned or may not be aligned with contemporary views and beliefs. And then we have to see how we can present that in the way that the contemporary generations appreciate and understand, without changing the main structure of philosophy and culture.
Yes,
right?
Thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking and I think significantly deep discussion. Thank you for you're sparing your time and sharing your wisdom, Maharaj.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a nice discussion. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Maharaj. Thank you.